Thank you for joining us on our look at the life of Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni. Before we begin, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support really does help us. The world into which Boudica was born was one of deep contrasts, where the old ways of Celtic Britain still held sway. But the power of Rome was spreading across the island like a tide that would not recede. Before her life became legend, before her name was written in the accounts of men who viewed her as both threat and marvel, the land of Britain was divided into tribes, each with their own rulers, customs, and loyalties. Among them the Iceni held their ground in what is now Norfolk, a people proud of their independence and rich in horses, warriors, and the traditions of their forefathers. They lived in a land of low rolling fields and winding rivers, with the North Sea pressing against their eastern shore and thick forests to the west. For centuries the Iceni had lived without any master above them, farming their land, worshipping their gods, and fighting their rivals when the need arose. This was the Britain of the 1st century, a land that to the Romans seemed wild and dangerous, yet also filled with resources to exploit. Long before Rome arrived, the tribes of Britain had been part of the broader Celtic world. They spoke a tongue close to that of their cousins in Gaul. They wore clothes of wool dyed in bright colours, and they decorated their bodies with intricate patterns that marked them out in war. Their leaders held power through wealth and reputation, and the Druids held the wisdom of their religion, keeping alive the sacred traditions that bound the tribes together. The Celts were farmers, but they were also warriors, and battle was not only a matter of survival but of honour. By the time Boudica was born, Rome had already become the great power of the known world. Its legions had crossed into Britain in the year 43 under Emperor Claudius, seeking both glory and wealth. The conquest was slow and bloody, but it brought Britain into the orbit of an empire that stretched from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germany. Rome was efficient in its methods. The legions marched, forts were built, and the tribes were subdued one by one. Yet while some tribes resisted fiercely, others sought to make peace, hoping to gain from Rome's favour rather than fall beneath its sword. The Iceni at first had chosen this path. They were not a tribe eager for destruction, and their rulers looked to balance pride with survival. Rome was too strong to resist directly. The legions fought with discipline, their armour gleaming, their shields held tight, their swords short but deadly. Against this, the wild charges of the Celtic warriors, who fought with long swords and unarmoured bodies, often could not prevail. Yet Rome did not demand immediate destruction of all who stood before it. The empire often worked through local rulers, allowing them to keep their thrones so long as they paid tribute, provided resources, and acknowledged Roman supremacy. It was within this fragile arrangement that Boudica's people lived when she was young. The Iceni's neighbours were the Trinovantes to the south, and the powerful Catuvellauni beyond them. For years the Catuvellauni had been Rome's chief concern in the east of Britain, for they were strong and ambitious, seeking to dominate other tribes. When Rome crushed their power, many smaller tribes sought Rome's protection. This balance of power mattered deeply to the Iceni, who found themselves caught between stronger neighbours and the shadow of Rome itself. Life for the average person in Iceni lands was simple and hard, tied to the cycles of farming and the seasons. Villages were clusters of roundhouses with thatched roofs, walls of wattle and daub, and a central hearth where families gathered. Fields were worked with wooden ploughs drawn by oxen, and crops such as barley and wheat provided the staple food. Cattle and horses were prized, for they were symbols of wealth and power as much as sources of meat and labour. Women worked alongside men in the fields, and though their lives were harsh, they also held more freedom than women in many other societies of the ancient world. Celtic women could inherit wealth, rule as queens, and even fight in battle. It was within this tradition that Boudica's own destiny would later take shape. Religion shaped much of life, and the Druids held great power in the spiritual and social order. They were priests, teachers, and judges, keeping alive the oral traditions that guided their people. The Celts believed in gods tied to nature, gods of rivers, forests, war, and fertility. Sacred groves and lakes were places of worship. and offerings were cast into the waters to honor the divine. To the Romans, these practices often seemed strange and savage, but to the tribes they were the bond that held the world together. The Druids taught that the soul did not perish, but passed on after death, and this belief gave Celtic warriors a fearlessness in battle that the Romans both feared and respected. Into this world Boudica was born, though the exact date is lost to us. Historians place her birth somewhere in the years after Rome's first arrival, perhaps around 30 AD, a time when the future of Britain was still uncertain. She would have grown up hearing tales of Rome's legions, of battles lost and won, and of the choices her people faced. As a girl, she would have seen warriors practice with their swords and spears, horses being bred and trained, and druids speaking the words of ritual by sacred fires. Her education would not have been in books, for the Celts valued memory and spoken word, but she would have learned the traditions of her people, the skills of leadership, and perhaps even the art of war. The Iceni had a ruler who sought to walk the narrow path between submission and defiance. This was Antiochus, who is thought to have been king when the Romans first came to Britain. He chose alliance with Rome rather than open resistance, hoping to preserve his tribe's independence under Roman oversight. This was the fragile peace into which Boudica grew, though as she aged she would see how little security such arrangements truly offered. Rome was not content to leave its allies untouched. Tribute grew heavier, Roman demands harsher, and the presence of soldiers ever more threatening. Yet in these early years, before the storm of rebellion that would later define her life, the world was still balanced between two forces. On one side stood the traditions of the Celts, with their tribal loyalties, their proud independence, and their fierce love of freedom. On the other side was Rome, a machine of empire, relentless in its desire to expand, to bring order and control, to profit from new lands and people. For a time these two worlds coexisted in Britain, though uneasily. The Iceni, like others, were caught between them, neither fully free nor yet fully subdued. Boudica's early life must have been shaped by the tension of this existence. She would have grown into womanhood, knowing that her people were proud but also vulnerable, their independence preserved only by the choices of their leaders and the shifting priorities of Rome. She would have seen the wealth that trade with Rome brought, fine goods such as glass, wine, and pottery, but also the resentment that came with heavy tribute and Roman arrogance. She would have known the pride of her tribe in their horses and warriors, but also the whispers of fear when Roman legions marched nearby. The Britain before Boudica's rise was thus a land in flux. Old tribal rivalries still mattered, but Rome was now the ultimate power. The Iceni, who once fought their neighbours freely, now had to measure every act against the will of an empire that cared little for their traditions. It was a world of compromise and unease, where some sought favour from Rome while others plotted resistance. For Boudica, this was the soil from which her later defiance would grow. When she was young, she could not have known that she would become the symbol of the greatest uprising Britain had ever seen against Rome. Yet the seeds of that rebellion were already being sown in the years before she took the stage. Rome's hunger for control, the pride of the Iceni, the faith in Celtic freedom, all were forces waiting to clash. In the world before Boudica, Britain was not yet conquered in spirit. Even if Rome's power was growing by the year, the people still dreamed of freedom, and they still believed in their gods, their warriors, and their queens. Boudica would carry those dreams forward, but for now she was a child of a land balanced on the edge of empire, a land where the old and the new met in uneasy truce, a land that waited for a leader to rise. Boudica's childhood remains hidden in the silence of history, for no records exist from her own people. And what we know of her comes only from Roman writers, who cared little for the details of her life before she became their enemy. Yet it is possible to imagine what her early years were like from what is known of her tribe and her time. She was born into the Iceni, a people known for their wealth in horses and their strong identity in the east of Britain. And as a child of high standing, she would have been raised with more privilege than most of her kin. The Iceni had long valued horses both for war and trade, and their land was well suited to breeding them. A young girl of noble family would have grown up surrounded by this wealth, with horses not only as animals of use, but as a symbol of prestige. From an early age she may have ridden them, learning to control their speed across the wide open fields of Norfolk, an education that marked her as part of the ruling class. In her home she would have lived in a settlement larger and stronger than most ordinary villages. The dwellings of her people were roundhouses of wood and thatch, their smoke curling up from central hearths, their walls daubed with clay, their floors spread with reeds and furs. In such a home Boudica would have grown surrounded by kin and servants, for noble families lived not only with parents and siblings, but with extended relatives, warriors, and bondsmen. Daily life revolved around farming and herding, but for someone of her status there would have been an added layer of expectation. She would be watched closely, groomed for a future in which she might marry into another noble house, strengthening bonds between tribes or within her own. Women of the Celtic world were not silent figures. Unlike in many other ancient cultures, Celtic women could hold power, lead tribes' own land, and inherit wealth. Boudica would have been aware of this from her earliest years. She would have seen women take part in decision-making, standing beside men at councils, their voices listened to, their advice respected. Among the Celts, women could also fight. There were stories of women warriors who had taken up arms, and though most did not, the image of a woman leading or fighting was not considered unnatural. Such stories must have fed the imagination of a young girl like Boudica, who grew up in a world where the possibility of leadership was open to her. Her education would have been practical rather than scholarly. The Druids, who were keepers of knowledge, preserved their teachings by memory and spoken word rather than writing. Boudica would have been taught the songs and tales of her people, the laws and customs, the stories of gods and heroes, and the skills needed to manage land, family, and dependence. She may have learned some craft, perhaps weaving or managing household stores, but she would also have been schooled in the traditions of hospitality and diplomacy, for a noble household was a center of alliance. Guests had to be welcomed, disputes had to be smoothed, and respect had to be shown in all dealings. Such training would later serve her when she rose to rule as queen. The Iceni at this time were living in uneasy balance with Rome. To the Romans they were an allied tribe, permitted to keep their independence so long as they caused no trouble. Rome stationed soldiers in nearby territories and demanded tribute, but the Iceni were not yet crushed beneath direct rule. This arrangement gave their leaders a degree of security, yet it also created tension. Wealth flowed into the tribe through trade with Rome. Fine pottery, glass, wine, and ornaments arrived, luxury goods that marked the nobles out from their poorer kin. Yet every gift from Rome carried with it the shadow of control, for the Iceni knew that their independence was allowed only so long as Rome willed it. These politics would have been present in the world that shaped Boudica, even if she did not yet take part in them. She would have heard her elders speak of Roman demands, of legions marching in the south, of rebellions crushed elsewhere. Such talk would have entered her childhood as stories of threat and caution, reminders that though the Iceni were proud, they lived under the gaze of an empire. At some point, as she came of age, she was married to Prasutagus, who would become king of the Iceni. The details of their union are lost, but it was almost certainly arranged, a match that secured alliances and strengthened the leadership of the tribe. In Celtic culture, marriage was not only a personal affair, but a political one, linking families and ensuring stability. Boudica would have been chosen not only for her noble birth, but also for her character, her ability to serve as queen, mother, and partner in rule. Prasutagus himself was a man who would later choose compromise with Rome. But in these early years he was the leader of a tribe that still valued independence, and was proud of its traditions. Boudica's marriage to him elevated her to the position of queen. This was no idle role. A Celtic queen was expected to manage wealth, command respect, and represent her people. She was a visible figure of power, and in many cases she could act with authority equal to her husband. For Boudica this meant that her life shifted from the duties of a noble daughter to the greater responsibilities of a queen. She would have been expected to take part in councils, to oversee the distribution of resources, and to act as host to allies and guests. Her voice would have been heard in matters of politics, and her presence would have carried weight. It was in these years that she gave birth to her daughters, who would later become central figures in her story. The names of the girls are lost, erased by history, but they were known to Rome and to the Iceni alike, for they were the heirs of Prasutagus and Boudica. The upbringing of these daughters would have been one of her main tasks, ensuring that they were raised with the pride and strength of their people. In a society where women could inherit power, their futures were important not only to their family, but to the tribe as a whole. Boudica's life with Prasutagus would have been marked by the balance between tradition and the growing presence of Rome. The Iceni continued to worship their gods and honor their customs, but Roman influence crept ever deeper into daily life. Roman traders brought goods that became symbols of status. Roman officials appeared to discuss tribute and law. Roman soldiers loomed in forts not far from Iceni land. For a queen like Boudica, the challenge was to maintain the dignity of her people while adapting to the reality of Roman power. Descriptions of Boudica, written later by Roman historians, give us some sense of her appearance. They tell us she was tall, with long hair that fell in waves to her waist, and with a presence that commanded fear and respect. Though these accounts may have been colored by the desire to make her seem strange and fearsome, they also hint at the fact that she was striking even by Roman standards. As queen, she would have worn clothes dyed in bright colors, perhaps a cloak fastened with a brooch of bronze or silver, and she may have adorned herself with jewelry of gold, for the Iceni were skilled in metalwork. Her image would have been one of power and wealth, a living symbol of her tribe. For years she and Prasutagus maintained their position by accepting Rome's overlordship while keeping local control. It was not an easy role. Rome was both ally and oppressor, and the Iceni had to walk a narrow path. At times they resisted, at times they submitted, but always the shadow of Rome was present. Boudica's part in this was as the steady partner to her husband, ensuring that the tribe remained united, that their people accepted the compromises needed for survival. Yet beneath the surface, the resentment of Rome's interference was never far away. In her marriage and early queenship, Boudica would have learned the art of leadership. She would have seen the importance of diplomacy, the need to hold her people together, the delicate balance between defiance and cooperation. These lessons would later guide her in the most difficult days of her life, when she faced not only the might of Rome, but also the challenge of uniting tribes who had long been divided. Her early years were a preparation, though she could not have known it, for the role she would play in leading one of the greatest uprisings in the history of Britain. The Iceni in this time were still proud, still rich, still their own people. They rode their horses across the open fields, they gathered in councils, they honored their gods in sacred places, they traded for goods both local and Roman. Yet change was coming. Rome's demands would grow heavier, its arrogance greater, its willingness to tolerate independence less secure. For now Boudica lived as queen beside her husband, mother of daughters, a woman respected by her people. She had not yet been tested, but the seeds of her destiny were planted. The Iceni would not remain untouched, and Boudica would not remain a queen in quiet. The years of peace, such as they were, formed the background to her life before the storm. She was a woman of strength, visible in her bearing, rooted in her traditions, proud of her people. She would have been admired and feared even before she raised her voice against Rome. Her life as wife and mother, as queen and hostess, as leader and listener, shaped the woman who would later become a symbol of resistance. Though she did not yet know it, her name would one day echo through history, carried not by her role beside her husband, but by the fire she would unleash after his death. The years of uneasy peace that Boudica and her husband had held together were never more than a fragile arrangement. Rome had no true allies, only subjects who were tolerated so long as they obeyed. Prasutagus had kept the Iceni safe by showing loyalty to Rome, presenting himself as a friend of the empire, and giving tribute when required. This allowed him to keep his crown, allowed his people to remain outwardly independent, and gave time for his household to grow in wealth and stature. Yet it was never a lasting bargain, for Rome's nature was to consume what it touched. The Iceni had not been conquered by the sword in open war, but Rome intended that one day they would be fully absorbed into the empire. Prasutagus knew this, and as he aged he thought of the future of his daughters, of his wife, and of his people. He saw what had happened to other tribes who had resisted. He saw what happened to those who were declared enemies. Lands seized, people sold into slavery, leaders killed or dragged before Roman governors to be humiliated. To avoid this fate, he sought a path that he thought would protect those he loved. His decision was to name the Roman emperor as co-heir with his daughters. In his will he tried to bind Rome into honoring his family, believing that by giving Rome half his wealth and authority, the other half would remain with his bloodline. It was a strange arrangement by Roman standards, but not unknown. Rome often worked through client kings who passed their thrones to their heirs so long as loyalty was secure. Prasutagus believed that the goodwill he had shown would be repaid with respect. He believed that his compromise would shield his daughters and his wife from Rome's greed. When death came for Prasutagus, it was not in battle but in age. He had ruled long enough to see the balance hold, long enough to think his plan might succeed. But when he passed, the mask of Roman tolerance was ripped away. The governor of Britain at that time was Suetonius Paulinus, a man hard and disciplined, who thought little of the traditions of the tribes. To him, the will of Prasutagus meant nothing. Rome recognized no queen in Iceni land, no daughters as heirs, no freedom for a client tribe once its king was gone. The emperor in Rome may have been named in the will, but Roman officials cared nothing for sharing rule with the daughters of a dead barbarian. When Prasutagus died, Roman officials and soldiers descended upon the Iceni lands. They treated the will not as a pact, but as an insult, a sign that the Iceni thought themselves equal to Rome. The wealth of the tribe was seized. Nobles were stripped of their estates, their lands taken, their goods carried away as if they were spoils of war. Worse still was the treatment of Boudica and her daughters. As the widow of the king, she should have been shown honor, but instead she was subjected to humiliation. Roman writers tell us that she was flogged, beaten before her people, her body lashed by soldiers who mocked her as they did it. Her daughters, still young, were dragged away and violated. This was not only cruelty but a calculated act of domination. Rome meant to show that the Iceni were broken, that their queen was powerless, that her heirs were defiled, and that their nobility was nothing before Roman will. To the Romans this was simply how empire worked. To the Iceni it was an outrage that could not be borne. The flogging of their queen and the assault upon her daughters were not private shames, but public insults to the whole tribe. Honor was the fabric of their world, and once it was torn, revenge was demanded. Every noble of the Iceni, every warrior who still had pride, would have felt the sting of that insult as if it had been upon them. The Romans had not only seized property, they had struck at the heart of their identity. At the same time, lenders and moneymen from Rome pressed down upon the tribe. Even the wealth that remained was not safe. Seneca, the philosopher and advisor to the Emperor Nero, had lent vast sums to the tribes of Britain. And now, at this very moment, he called in the debts. Loans that had been offered perhaps as a way of binding tribes into dependency were demanded back at once, and with heavy interest. The Iceni were strangled both by humiliation and by debt. Rome's grip tightened not only with the sword but with money. Boudica now stood alone as queen, but her authority was trampled by Rome. To her people she remained their rightful leader, but to the Romans she was no more than a widow, her voice silenced, her rule denied. Yet it was in this moment of cruelty and despair that her destiny changed. Before, she had been a queen who balanced peace and survival. Now she was a woman wronged beyond endurance, her daughters dishonored, her tribe stripped, her dignity scourged in the sight of her people. Such wounds could not heal in silence. The story of her flogging and her daughters' suffering spread quickly. Tribes beyond the Iceni heard of it. To them it was a warning, but also a rallying cry. If Rome could do this to a queen who had been loyal, then none were safe. If Rome could ignore a king's will, seize lands, whip a ruler, and violate her children, then every tribe was threatened. The wrong done to Boudica became the wrong of all. Her private grief became public fury. It is hard to imagine the moment itself, when Roman soldiers dragged her forward and whipped her. She had been tall, proud, and striking, and before her people she was reduced to pain and shame. Her daughter's cries would have torn at her, for no mother could see such suffering and not be broken. Yet from that breaking came a resolve that would shape history. She would not accept this fate, and she would not let it pass. The blood of the Iceni demanded vengeance, and Boudica would be the one to bring it. The Romans misjudged her deeply. To them she was a woman of no consequence, a barbarian queen whose rule ended with her husband. To them her daughters were only girls to be used as symbols of domination. They believed the Iceni would cower, pay their debts, and accept their chains. But the Romans did not understand the strength of the ties between queen and tribe, between family and honor. They did not see that by humiliating Boudica, they had ignited a fire that would spread far beyond her household. After the death of Prasutagus, Boudica's life was turned upside down. Where once she had walked as queen beside her husband, managing affairs and securing peace, now she stood alone in grief and anger. The Romans had stripped her wealth, destroyed her authority, and attacked her family. Yet they had also freed her from the binds of compromise. There was no peace left to keep, no balance left to hold. Rome had shattered the fragile pact, and all that remained was the path of resistance. Among her people, support grew. The nobles who had lost their lands looked to her as a leader who shared their pain. The warriors who had seen their queen whipped and her daughters abused burned with rage. The Druids, who hated Rome's suppression of their faith, saw in her a figure chosen by the gods to restore freedom. Her daughters themselves, scarred though they were, stood as living reminders of Roman cruelty. Every eye turned to Boudica, and in her grief they saw their own. In her anger they found their voice. The Romans had hoped to secure Iceni land quietly, to absorb it without costly rebellion. Instead, they had planted the seeds of the greatest revolt Britain had yet seen. Boudica's suffering became a story retold by firelight, carried from village to village, from tribe to tribe. It joined with old resentments, with debts unpaid, with wounds left open from years of Roman arrogance. The Iceni were not alone. Other tribes had tasted Roman greed, had lost land, had seen their nobles displaced and their temples desecrated. The Trinovantes, neighbors of the Iceni, were restless. Their hatred of Rome deepened by the building of a Roman colony on their sacred land at Camulodunum. Boudica's wrongs were added to theirs, and the two tribes found a common cause. Prasutagus' death was thus not the end of a line, but the beginning of an uprising. His will had sought peace, but in death it became the spark of war. He had tried to secure Rome's favor, but Rome's betrayal ensured instead that his widow would rise against them. The years he spent balancing between loyalty and independence had ended in failure, but the insult done to his family gave his people a new path. Boudica was now more than a queen. She was a symbol of injustice. Her name, once spoken only among her people, began to spread. Her tall figure, her striking hair, her commanding presence, all became part of a growing legend even before the first blow of rebellion was struck. The death of Prasutagus had left a void, but in that void Boudica stepped forward. Rome thought her broken, but instead she had become unbreakable. The betrayal of Rome could not be undone. The lashes on her back, the tears of her daughters, the stolen lands of her nobles, these were scars that no treaty could heal. Rome had shown its true face, and Boudica had seen it clearly. From this moment her life was set on a new course, one that would carry her from the fields of Norfolk to the burning ruins of Roman towns, from the role of widow to that of war leader, from suffering to vengeance. The death of her husband was the end of one chapter, but for Boudica it was the beginning of her true story, the story that would echo down through centuries as the tale of the woman who defied Rome. The story of Boudica's rebellion begins not in the clash of armies, but in the raw pain of shame and fury. The Romans had made their mistake when they chose to humiliate rather than simply subdue. They might have taken Iceni lands, they might have demanded tribute, and still the tribe could have been forced into sullen acceptance. But by lashing their queen in public and violating her daughters, Rome had gone further than conquest. They had struck at the soul of a people who valued honor above life. For the Iceni, this outrage was not only a family's suffering, it was the tribe itself brought low. In their eyes, the queen was more than a woman. She was the visible body of their pride, the one who carried their authority, the one who gave legitimacy to their line. To whip her was to whip the tribe. To assault her daughters was to poison the future of the Iceni. These acts could not be forgotten, nor could they be endured. They were like fire set to dry grass, burning quickly across the land, lighting anger in every heart. The world of the Celts was built on ideas of honor and revenge. To leave such insults unpunished was to invite weakness. If a nobleman was wronged, he was bound to avenge himself, and if a tribe was wronged, they were bound to rise. To do nothing was to admit that they were slaves. The men of the Iceni would not accept that, nor would their women, who had seen their queen brought low. It was whispered around hearths and in councils that the Romans must pay, that the gods themselves demanded it. The Druids, who had long hated Roman rule and the destruction of their sacred groves, added their voices. They spoke of omens, of divine signs that Rome's time was short, of visions of ruin for the oppressor. Boudica herself had every reason to stand at the center of this storm. She had felt the lashes on her skin. She had held her daughters as they cried in pain. She had seen her tribe robbed and insulted. Where once she had balanced patience and diplomacy, now her only thought was justice. She became the focus of the anger of her people, for she embodied their wound and their will to fight. Her tall frame, her long flowing hair, her fierce voice, all gave her a presence that inspired those around her. The men saw in her a leader who carried their rage without fear. The women saw in her the strength of their sex. Standing where others might have fallen silent, she began to speak, and her words were not those of a widow broken, but of a queen who demanded vengeance. She reminded her people that Rome had shown its true face. They had whipped their queen, they had stolen their wealth, they had trampled their honor, they had mocked their gods. If such crimes could be endured, then the Iceni were nothing but slaves. But if they rose, if they struck back, they could show the world that they were still free. Her words were carried from village to village, from hall to hall. Men began sharpening their swords. Women prepared food and stores. Scouts rode out to watch Roman movements. The Iceni were not alone. Other tribes had suffered similar indignities, and when they heard of Boudica's plight, they too began to stir. Chief among them were the Trinovantes, who had long borne grudges against Rome. Their sacred city of Camulodunum had been seized by the Romans, turned into a colony for veterans of the legions, men who lorded over the land and treated the natives with contempt. A temple to the Emperor Claudius had been built there, a vast stone symbol of Roman power, and the people were forced to pay for its upkeep. To the Trinovantes, this was a daily reminder of their loss, a wound that would not heal. When they heard that Boudica was preparing to rise, they joined her gladly, seeing in her the leader who could give shape to their anger. Meetings were held in secret groves and hidden clearings. Tribes sent messengers. Alliances were sworn. Oaths were spoken before gods and ancestors. The Druids lent their blessings, declaring that the spirits of the land favored the rebellion. Old rivalries between tribes were put aside, for Rome was the greater enemy. Warriors painted their bodies with blue dye, sharpened their spears and swords, and made ready their chariots. The women too prepared to march, for Celtic armies often included women, whether to fight or to support. The rebellion was no small rising, but a mass movement of people who believed they were fighting for their very existence. The Romans, caught up in their arrogance, saw little of this storm as it gathered. The governor Suetonius Paulinus was far to the west, leading a campaign in Wales against the Druids of Mona, now Anglesey. He believed that crushing the Druids would break the spiritual heart of resistance in Britain, and so his legions were far from Iceni land. The towns in the east were lightly defended, their colonies unprepared, their people unarmed. The Romans trusted in their aura of invincibility, in the fear they had long inspired. They thought the Iceni cowed, their queen broken, their allies weak. They could not have been more wrong. Boudica's moment came when she and her allies gathered their forces and made their decision to strike. She addressed them not as subjects, but as free people, reminding them of their wrongs and promising them vengeance. Accounts from Roman writers later claimed she spoke of fighting not as a queen seeking power, but as a woman wronged, leading a people who would not live in chains. She told them that the Romans were not gods but men, that their cities could burn, their soldiers could die, and their empire could be wounded. Her voice carried across fields where thousands had gathered, warriors stamping their feet, shouting their approval, ready to follow her wherever she led. The rebellion began with fire. The first target was Camulodunum, the Roman colony that stood as a symbol of everything they hated. But before the march on the city, the spirit of the rebellion was already alive. Villages that had bent to Rome cast off their fear. Nobles who had lost their estates took up arms again. The Iceni rode their horses across the land, calling others to join them. The Trinovantes poured in from the south, eager to strike at the temple that mocked their gods. Boudica herself rode at the head of this force, not hidden behind the men but visible to all. Tall and fierce, with her hair flowing and her cloak clasped by a brooch, she looked every part the queen of war. She drove a chariot, as Celtic leaders often did, her daughters beside her, reminders of the crimes that had set all this in motion. The sight of them stirred the people to greater fury, for here was not only a queen, but a mother demanding justice for her children. In her presence they found courage, and in their numbers she found the strength to believe that Rome could be struck. The rebellion was not only about land or wealth, it was about dignity. It was about showing that they were not slaves, that their gods were not defeated, that their honor was not lost. Every warrior who joined her carried his own wound, his own memory of Roman insult. Every woman who marched carried her own grievance, her own anger at the invaders. Together they became more than a collection of tribes. They became a people united by fury, led by a woman who had suffered more than most and who refused to bow. The spark had been struck by Rome itself, and now the fire could not be controlled. The Iceni no longer thought of compromise. The Trinovantes no longer thought of patience. The Druids no longer whispered in secret. All came into the open, their voices loud, their weapons ready. They would march, they would burn, they would kill, and they would show the empire that Britain was not yet conquered. When Boudica looked upon the host she had gathered, she must have felt both grief and pride. Grief for the suffering that had brought them to this point, grief for her husband gone, for her daughters shamed, for her people dishonored. But pride too, for here were thousands ready to fight, not cowed by Rome, but eager to strike. She had turned pain into power, humiliation into rage, and rage into a cause that united tribes who had long stood apart. The Romans had thought her broken. They had thought her people broken. Instead, they had forged her into a weapon, and her tribe into an army. From this moment there could be no turning back. The rebellion had begun, and it would carry her name through the ages. The rebellion was no longer a whisper carried in secret. It had become a roar that spread across the countryside, calling all who had felt the weight of Rome to rise. What had begun with the humiliation of one queen was now the voice of many tribes. Boudica had lit the fire, but it was the people of Britain who fanned it, and in the months that followed a force gathered unlike any the Romans had expected to face. The Iceni and the Trinovantes formed the heart of this rising. Their lands had suffered most from Roman arrogance, their pride had been cut deepest, and their desire for revenge burned hottest. Yet they were not alone. Messages were sent to neighboring tribes, carried by swift horsemen and trusted envoys. These men and women rode through forests and fields, speaking not only of the shame of Boudica, but of the insults Rome had heaped upon all the Britons. They reminded their listeners that Rome took their wealth, mocked their gods, and trampled their freedom. They called on them to set aside old rivalries and stand together. For if Rome was not struck down now, there would never be another chance. The response was swift. Tribes who had once been enemies found themselves bound together by the common wound of conquest. Old grudges mattered little when set against the greater hatred of the foreign occupier. The Romans had thought the tribes too divided to ever unite, but they had underestimated the strength of shared rage. In meetings held in clearings and sacred groves, oaths were sworn. Chiefs clasped hands in friendship, warriors promised to fight side by side, and druids declared that the gods themselves blessed this union. Boudica was at the center of these gatherings. Her presence commanded attention wherever she went. Tall and fierce, her long hair unbound, she spoke with a voice that carried the weight of both grief and resolve. She reminded the tribes of her flogging, of her daughter's suffering, of the theft of her people's land. She reminded them too of their own wrongs, of the debts forced upon them, of the colonies built on their sacred ground, of the taxes that drained their wealth. She told them that Rome was not invincible, that its soldiers were far away with the governor, that its towns in the east were undefended. Her words were fire, and the tribes fed on them until their anger was hotter than their fear. For the Druids, this was the moment they had long prayed for. They had seen their power weakened by Rome, their sacred groves threatened, their teaching scorned. Now they saw in Boudica a vessel of divine will. They spoke of omens that favored her cause. They told of the goddess Andraste, whom Boudica herself called upon, a goddess of victory who demanded vengeance on Rome. In rituals held before battle, the Druids called down blessings, and the warriors who listened believed that they fought not only for themselves, but with the gods at their side. The army that gathered was unlike the disciplined ranks of Rome. It was a mass of tribes, a sea of men and women armed with whatever weapons they possessed. Spears, swords, axes, hunting knives, farm tools turned into weapons, all were carried to the gathering places. Chariots were made ready, their horses prancing and snorting, their wheels set with blades to cut through Roman ranks. Warriors painted their bodies in blue dye, their hair stiffened with lime, their faces fierce with determination. They came not in armor of metal, but in cloaks and tunics, trusting in speed and fury more than in shields. They brought their families with them, for this was not a war of soldiers alone, but a movement of whole peoples. The numbers swelled day by day. Tens of thousands joined, far more than Rome had ever believed possible. Estimates given later by Roman writers speak of 100,000 or more, though no one can know for certain. What mattered was not the exact number, but the sheer size of the host. Rome's towns, scattered and lightly guarded, could never hope to stand against such a force. The legions themselves were far to the west with Suetonius Paulinus, leaving behind only small garrisons that could not hope to resist. This was the moment when fear shifted from the tribes to the Romans. Until now it had always been the Britons who looked upon Roman soldiers with dread, their armor gleaming, their shields locked in unbreakable lines. Now it was the Romans who began to fear. Traders and settlers in the colonies heard rumors of the rising and grew uneasy. Governors in the towns sent word for reinforcements, but knew they would not come in time. The temple of Claudius at Camulodunum stood proud, its priests boasting of Rome's eternal rule, but even their unease spread as news of the swelling host reached them. Boudica's daughters rode with her, symbols of the crimes that had sparked the rising. Their presence stirred the tribes more than words ever could. To see the young girls who had suffered at Roman hands reminded every warrior of what was at stake. This was not only about land or tribute. It was about protecting their families from such shame, about ensuring that Rome would never again treat their daughters and wives as slaves. The sight of the queen and her children in the chariot became a banner under which all could unite. There were those who hesitated, fearing the might of Rome. To them Boudica spoke with a force that cut away their doubts. She told them that Rome had grown weak with arrogance, that its soldiers were far away, that its towns were open. She told them that they had nothing left to lose, for if they did not rise now they would be ground into the dust forever. Better to die free, she said, than to live as slaves. Her words were not polished speeches written for show, but the raw truth of a woman who had suffered and who demanded action. They believed her because she spoke what they already knew in their hearts. As the host gathered strength, it also gathered purpose. They would not march blindly, but would strike at the heart of Roman presence in the east. Their first target would be Camulodunum, the colony that embodied everything they despised. It was there that Roman veterans strutted on stolen land. It was there that the temple to Clodius drained the wealth of the people. It was there that the Trinovantes had seen their sacred city desecrated. The choice of target was obvious, and the warriors hungered for the march. The days before the attack were filled with preparation. Spears were bound tighter, Chariots checked, food gathered, omens read. Fires burned through the night as warriors sang songs of war, beating their shields, chanting the names of their gods. Women sang too, their voices rising in wild cries that echoed across the fields. Children watched wide-eyed as their fathers and mothers prepared to fight, knowing that the fate of their world was about to be decided. The Romans had long believed that the Britons were too scattered, too bound to their tribal feuds, to ever mount a united rebellion. They were blind to the fact that their own cruelty had broken those divisions. Where once the tribes had fought each other, now they marched side by side. The Iceni and Trinovantes were joined by others from further afield, smaller tribes who saw in this rising their chance to throw off Roman chains. The mass of people moved as one, a tide of defiance rolling towards the first city of their revenge. The power of this moment lay not only in numbers but in belief. The tribes believed that their gods were with them, that their cause was just, that their queen was chosen. They believed that Rome could be beaten. That belief gave them strength greater than weapons, for they no longer feared death. To die in battle was honourable, and to die for their queen and their people was to be remembered forever. Against such conviction, Rome would find itself facing not only warriors, but a force of spirit it could not easily break. Boudica herself must have felt the weight of what was coming. She had lost her husband, she had suffered deeply, and now she bore the hopes of tens of thousands. Yet she did not falter. She rode among her people, speaking to them, sharing their meals, joining their chants. She was not distant but close, a queen who stood with her tribe. Her strength was their strength, and their loyalty to her grew with every passing day. She had become more than a queen. She had become the living embodiment of resistance. When the host at last began its march towards Camulodunum, the ground shook beneath their feet, and the air rang with their cries. Chariots rolled forward. Horses snorted and pawed the earth. Warriors shouted to one another as they strode towards their enemy. At the front was Boudica, her daughters beside her, her hair flying, her arm raised to lead them. Behind her stretched a sea of people united by rage and bound by hope. Rome had thought them weak. Rome would soon see how wrong it had been. The march to Camulodunum was more than a movement of people. It was the transformation of rage into action. The Iceni, the Trinovantes, and their allies swept forward across the countryside like a tide that could not be stopped. They carried with them not only weapons, but the weight of generations of anger and the fresh memory of shame. The Romans had believed they had crushed the spirit of the tribes, but now the land itself seemed alive with defiance. Camps were abandoned, fields left untended, villages emptied as men, women, and even children followed the call of Boudica. Camulodunum was the target chosen not only for strategy, but for meaning. To the Romans it was a proud colony, a model of how Britain could be remade in their image. To the Britons it was a wound that never closed. Once it had been the centre of the Trinovantes, a place of their power and their worship. But now it stood as a monument to their humiliation. Veterans of Rome's legions lived there, given land stolen from the people they despised. These men walked the streets as masters, boasting of their past victories, treating the natives as little more than slaves. Rising above all was the great temple to Claudius, the emperor who had first brought Rome's armies to Britain. Built with the forced labour and money of the tribes, it was a symbol of conquest, and to the Britons it mocked their gods and their freedom. The colonists had grown complacent. They were confident in the protection of Rome, though only a handful of soldiers were stationed nearby. They mocked the complaints of the natives, sneering at their anger, believing the tribes too weak and too divided to act. Even as news of unrest spread, they reassured themselves that the legions would come if needed. They trusted in stone walls, in Roman authority, and in the fear they believed they still commanded. Boudica's army saw none of this with awe. To them the city was a target, ripe for destruction, and its people were guilty simply by living upon stolen land. As the mass of warriors approached, the air filled with the sound of shouting and the pounding of hooves. Chariots raced ahead, wheels cutting the ground, horses tossing their manes. Behind came the flood of tribes, their faces marked with blue, their weapons raised, their voices crying out the names of their gods. It was a sight that must have struck terror into those who glimpsed it from the city walls. The attack fell with sudden fury. The colonists were unprepared. They had little by way of defences, no strong garrison to hold back the storm. A small force of Roman soldiers tried to resist, but they were swept aside by sheer numbers. The temple to Claudius was turned into a place of desperate refuge, where the settlers crowded in, hoping that its walls would keep them safe until reinforcements arrived. For 2 days they held out, but there was no rescue, and when the rebels broke through, the temple became a tomb. The priests who had once boasted of Rome's eternal power were cut down, their stone walls blackened by fire. The city itself was set alight. Flames roared through the wooden houses, smoke filled the air, and the cries of the dying echoed through the streets. Men, women, and children of the colony were killed without mercy. The tribes did not spare them, for to them mercy had long been denied by Rome. This was not only a battle but an act of vengeance. Every settler was a symbol of Roman arrogance, and every death was a blow struck for freedom. The destruction was total. Where once Rome had hoped to build a shining example of its empire, there now lay only charred ruins. To the Britons this was more than victory. It was justice. They had torn down the symbol of Roman rule, wiped away the colony that had mocked them, and proved to themselves and to the world that Rome could bleed. The temple to Claudius, once the proudest building in the city, was reduced to rubble, its ashes mingling with the bodies of those who had sheltered inside. The veterans who had strutted on their estates were gone, their wealth scattered, their arrogance silenced. Boudica herself rode through the burning city, her chariot moving slowly among the wreckage, her daughters beside her. To her people she was the embodiment of vengeance, the queen who had avenged her shame and shown that Rome was not invincible. The smoke and fire seemed to crown her as she lifted her arm, calling her warriors to press on. This was only the beginning, she told them. Camulodunum was the first to fall, but others would follow. London lay ahead, and after that, every Roman who set foot on their land. For the Romans the shock was deep. News of the destruction spread quickly, carried by survivors who fled into the countryside. They spoke of slaughter, of flames, of a host so vast it could not be counted. Panic spread to other towns, where settlers begged for help that could not come. The governor was far away in the west, and the legions could not march swiftly enough to save them. For the first time since their conquest began, the Romans in Britain felt vulnerable, their power shaken, their future uncertain. To the tribes, the fall of Camulodunum was proof that the gods favoured them. The Druids declared that Andraste had answered Boudica's call, that the spirits of the land had risen to drive out the invaders. Omens were read in the flames and the cries of the dying, and they were taken as signs of divine favour. Warriors who had once feared Roman discipline now believed that they could sweep the empire from their shores. Their confidence grew, and with it their numbers. More tribes joined, inspired by the victory, eager to share in the triumph. The army swelled again, and with each new band of warriors the rebellion became less a rising and more a movement of nations. The destruction of Camulodunum was not the end, but the beginning of a march that would carry fire from town to town. The people were united in fury, their hatred sharpened by success. They no longer whispered of freedom but shouted it, their voices rising above the smoke of burning Roman buildings. Among the survivors who escaped was a messenger who carried word to the Roman commander nearby. Petilius Cerealis, leading the 9th Legion, attempted to march to the colony's aid, but by the time he arrived the city was already destroyed. His forces clashed with Boudica's host and were annihilated. Only a handful of cavalry escaped, riding hard to spread the grim news. This defeat showed the Romans that they faced not a simple revolt, but a force capable of shattering a legion. It was a blow to their pride, and a warning that the rebellion was far from over. The tribes rejoiced at this victory. To destroy a Roman colony was one thing, but to defeat a legion was another. The legions were the core of Rome's power, feared across the world for their discipline and their skill. To see one broken gave the Britons hope that the others could be beaten as well. Around the fires at night the warriors spoke of driving the Romans into the sea, of taking back every field, every forest, every river that had been stolen. The rebellion was no longer only about vengeance for Boudica. It had become a war for the soul of Britain. Yet the destruction of Camulodunum was not without its cost. The violence was total, and even among the tribes there must have been voices uneasy at the scale of the slaughter. Women and children of the settlers had been cut down as ruthlessly as the soldiers and veterans. To the Romans this was proof of savagery, a sign that the Britons were no more than barbarians drunk on blood. To the tribes it was justice, harsh but deserved, a repayment for years of Roman cruelty. The memory of Boudica's flogging and her daughter's shame burned too brightly for mercy. The city's ruins smoked for days, a blackened scar on the land. Where once Rome had hoped to show its power, there now lay only the proof of its weakness. The ashes of Camulodunum were a warning to every Roman in Britain. They could not rest safe in their colonies. They could not trust in their temples. They could not rely on their legions to save them. Boudica had shown them that the tribes of Britain were no longer afraid. From the ruins the host moved on, their spirits lifted, their confidence fierce. Ahead lay London, already a growing centre of trade and Roman settlement, rich and tempting. The settlers there trembled as word reached them of what had happened to Camulodunum. Some fled before the rebels arrived, carrying what goods they could. Others stayed, hoping that Rome would defend them. But the Romans were slow to react, and Boudica's march was swift. The destruction of Camulodunum marked the true beginning of her campaign. It was the moment when the rebellion became a war, when the tribes saw that victory was possible, when Rome itself realized that it faced a crisis that could not be ignored. For Boudica, it was the first step in a march of fire that would scorch the land and leave behind a story remembered for centuries. The smoke of Camulodunum still hung in the air when Boudica turned her army south. The colony lay in ruins, its people slaughtered, its temple reduced to ash, and yet the fury of the tribes was not spent. They had won their first great victory, but their blood was still hot and their hunger for revenge stronger than ever. The destruction of one Roman colony was not enough. They wanted more. They wanted every Roman settlement in Britain wiped from the earth, and so their eyes turned to the growing town of Londinium. At this time Londinium was not yet the mighty city it would one day become, but it was already the beating heart of Roman commerce in the province. It stood by the Thames, where the river narrowed and offered a place for ships to land. Merchants came from across the empire, bringing wine, oil, glass pottery, and all the goods that Roman settlers desired. Roads spread out from the town, linking it to other parts of Britain. Though it had no grand walls or temples to rival Rome itself, it was fast becoming the symbol of Roman power and wealth in the east. For the tribes who followed Boudica, it was the perfect target. The settlers in Londinium had already heard what had happened at Camulodunum. Survivors from the colony had fled south, their stories wild with terror, telling of fire and slaughter, of a host too vast to count, of a queen who drove her chariot through the smoke with her daughters beside her. Panic spread quickly through the town. Traders packed up what goods they could and fled. Families loaded carts and wagons, heading for the safety of Roman forts. Those who stayed did so either because they had nowhere else to go, or because they believed that Rome would protect them. The governor Suetonius Paulinus had by now heard of the rebellion and had begun marching back from the west with his legions. He reached Londinium ahead of Boudica, and for a moment the settlers believed they might be saved. But Suetonius was a soldier first and a protector second. He looked at the town and saw a place impossible to defend. It had no walls, no strong garrison, no way to withstand the vast host marching towards it. To remain would be to risk the destruction of his legions. He chose instead to withdraw, taking with him those who could march quickly, leaving the town itself to its fate. His decision was harsh but practical. He knew the rebellion was too strong to fight head-on with the forces he had at that moment. He would regroup, gather his strength, and strike later. But for those who remained in Londinium, it was a death sentence. When Boudica's army arrived, they found the town abandoned by soldiers and filled only with those too slow or too stubborn to flee. What followed was as terrible as what had happened at Camulodunum. The tribes swarmed through the streets, looting, killing, and burning. Buildings were set alight, smoke rising into the sky, the wooden houses collapsing in flames. Merchants who had stayed to guard their goods were cut down. Women and children were shown no mercy. The tribes were not interested in sparing those who lived under Rome's protection. To them, every settler was part of the enemy, every Romanized Briton a traitor. The slaughter was complete. Roman writers would later describe it in grim detail, speaking of the rebels' cruelty, of bodies left unburied, of streets running with blood. To the Britons themselves it was justice. The people of Londinium had profited from Rome, had grown rich from trade that drained the tribes of their wealth, had lived under the protection of an empire that whipped their queen and defiled their daughters. Now they paid the price. The ashes of Londinium joined those of Camulodunum, and the rebellion rolled on. From Londinium the host turned north, west towards Verulamium, another Romanized town that had grown wealthy under the empire's rule. Verulamium was smaller than Londinium, but still a center of trade and settlement. Like the others, it had no strong walls, no garrison capable of holding back the storm. The settlers there must have known what was coming, for news of Boudica's march spread faster than her army itself. Many fled into the countryside, but again many remained, unable or unwilling to leave. The pattern repeated. The rebels descended, the town was overrun, and the buildings were put to the torch. Verulamium burned as Camulodunum and Londinium had burned before it. The destruction was not random but deliberate, a message written in fire that no Roman settlement in Britain was safe. Each town wiped from the map was a symbol of victory, each ruin a monument to the tribe's defiance. The scale of the killing shocked the Romans deeply. Tens of thousands were said to have died in these massacres. Later accounts from Roman historians, colored by both horror and propaganda, spoke of atrocities too grim to repeat, of methods of execution meant to terrify. Whether all these tales were true or exaggerated we cannot know, but there is no doubt that the rebellion swept away entire populations of settlers. The Romans who survived painted the rebels as savage, but to the Britons these actions were not savagery but revenge. Rome had shown them no mercy, and now they returned the same. For Boudica the victories were both personal and political. She had seen her enemies struck down, her people avenged, her power grow with every march. More tribes joined her, drawn by success, swelling her ranks until her host was said to be greater than any army Britain had ever seen. She had begun as a widow wronged, but now she was the leader of a nation in revolt. Her name carried weight, not only among the tribes but in Rome itself, where news of the uprising caused fear that Britain might be lost altogether. Yet there were signs that this storm could not last forever. The rebels were fierce but lacked the discipline of the Roman legions. They could destroy towns, kill settlers, and overwhelm small garrisons, but they had not yet faced the full might of Rome's armies. Suetonius Paulinus was regrouping, pulling his legions together, waiting for the moment to strike. He knew he could not defend every settlement, so he chose instead to let them burn while he gathered strength. His decision left thousands to die, but it also meant that when the time came he would have the army he needed. Still, in these weeks of fire and slaughter, it seemed as though Rome might truly be driven from Britain. 3 of its proudest towns lay in ruins. A legion had been destroyed. Tens of thousands of settlers were dead. The roads were filled with refugees, the countryside with smoke. The Britons believed the gods were with them. That victory was assured. The Druids declared that the land itself rose against Rome, that the spirits of rivers and forests joined their cause. In the glow of their triumphs they could not yet see the storm that was gathering against them. Boudica must have felt the strain of leading such a vast host. It was not an army in the Roman sense, drilled and obedient, but a mass of tribes, each with their own chiefs, their own customs, their own desires. Holding them together was no easy task. Old rivalries still lingered, and discipline was often loose. Warriors sometimes broke off to loot, or to take vengeance for themselves. Yet Boudica managed to hold the center, her presence uniting them in common cause. Her daughters remained at her side, symbols of the crimes that had begun it all, their faces a constant reminder of why the tribes fought. The marches between towns must have been scenes of both pride and hardship. Tens of thousands moving together required food, water, and rest, yet the people pressed on. Families followed with carts, bringing supplies, while herds of cattle were driven alongside to provide meat. The countryside itself became part of the rebellion, as villages supplied food and young men joined the march. To see the host pass must have been awe-inspiring, a river of people flowing across the land, banners waving, voices crying out in triumph. Each town that burned sent a new wave of fear through Rome. Settlers who had once lived with pride now lived in terror. Traders who had come seeking wealth fled back to Gaul. Soldiers who had believed Britain a safe posting now saw it as a graveyard. The name of Boudica spread quickly, carried by rumour and fear. To the Romans, she was a barbarian queen turned monster, a figure of dread. To her people she was a hero, chosen by the gods, a leader who had humbled the might of empire. Yet amid the triumph there were warnings. Rome was not an enemy that gave up easily. It had faced rebellions before, in Gaul, in Spain, in lands across the empire. It had always returned stronger, its legions grinding down resistance with ruthless patience. Suetonius Paulinus was no fool. He had sacrificed Londinium and Verulamium, not out of weakness but out of calculation. He was drawing his enemy towards him, waiting for the moment when discipline would meet fury, when order would meet chaos. But in these days of fire the tribes could not see that. To them the world was alive with victory. Their enemies lay dead, their oppressors driven out, their gods honoured by the smoke of burning Roman towns. They believed that freedom was within their grasp, that they had struck a blow that would echo for generations. And in truth they had. Even if the rebellion were to end in defeat, the ashes of Londinium and Verulamium would remain as proof that Rome could be challenged, that Britain was not easily subdued, that one queen's rage could shake an empire. The rebellion had burned like a storm across the land. Camulodunum lay in ruins, Londinium reduced to ash, Verulamium destroyed, and the bodies of tens of thousands scattered in the streets of towns that had once been proud symbols of Roman order. Boudica's host marched in triumph, swelling with every victory, believing the gods themselves had marked them for freedom. Yet, while the tribes celebrated, the governor Suetonius Paulinus was gathering his strength. He had not marched into the flames to defend the towns because he knew he would lose, and he would not scatter his forces to save settlers who could not be saved. Instead, he called his legions to him, hard men trained by years of war, and he prepared for the battle that would decide the fate of Britain. The legions that answered his call were fewer than Rome might have wished, but they were still formidable. He had perhaps 10,000 soldiers, a small number compared to the vast tide of warriors that followed Boudica. But each Roman was disciplined, armed, and drilled to fight as one. Their armour gleamed, their shields were broad, their short swords sharpened, and their experience stretched across the empire from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania. Suetonius knew that with the right ground and the right tactics, discipline could withstand numbers. He chose his ground with care, somewhere along the line of the great Roman road later called Watling Street, where the land narrowed between woods and hills. The open plain in front gave the tribes room to approach, but the Roman flanks were secure, and the rebels would have to funnel their vast horde into a space where their numbers could not surround him. It was the kind of ground a Roman commander loved, for it forced order upon chaos. Boudica's army was enormous by any measure. Roman sources, always eager to exaggerate, spoke of 200,000 or more. Even if this was inflated, the host was still vast, perhaps 4 or 5 times the number of Suetonius's men. Families had followed them, wagons and carts forming a line at the rear, filled with food, children, and the spoils of plunder. They came with chariots rattling, horses stamping, warriors painted in wood, their hair stiff with lime, their voices raised in wild cries. It was a sight that shook even hardened legionaries, for the mass of the tribes seemed endless, a rolling tide of humanity rushing forward for vengeance. Boudica herself rode at the head of this host. She was in her chariot, her daughters beside her, the queen who had suffered, the mother who had been wronged, the leader who had already burned towns and slaughtered a legion. She gave a speech before the battle, reminding her people of all that Rome had done. She told them they were fighting not only for her, but for their families, their freedom, their gods, their very lives. The Romans had stolen their land, whipped their queen, violated their daughters, and treated them as slaves. Now they had the chance to end it all in one blow. Her voice carried over the sea of warriors, and they roared their approval, beating their weapons on their shields, stamping their feet, crying out the names of their gods. It was a scene of passion and fury, a nation united against a foreign power. The Romans too were addressed. Suetonius spoke to his soldiers in clear, calm tones. He reminded them that they faced a mob, not an army. The Britons were fierce but undisciplined, wild but disorganized. They fought as individuals, but Rome fought as one. He told his men to hold their lines, to use their discipline, to trust in their training. He reminded them that they had survived worse odds in other lands, and that the empire depended on them now. His words were short and sharp, like the thrust of the gladius they carried, and his men listened with grim determination. They were not filled with frenzy, but with focus. The battle began with noise and motion. The Britons charged forward in waves, their chariots racing across the plain, horses foaming, wheels rattling, drivers shouting. Warriors hurled spears and stones, their cries echoing, their numbers pressing like a flood. Behind them more surged forward, a mass of bodies eager to close with the Romans and crush them beneath sheer force. But the ground betrayed them. The narrow plain forced them into a bottleneck, and their numbers pressed against one another, slowing their charge. The chariots that were meant to sweep and scatter became trapped in the crush of their own people. The Romans waited. Their lines stood firm, shields locked, pila ready. At the command they hurled their heavy javelins into the oncoming mass. The spears tore through the air and struck with deadly force, piercing bodies, breaking shields, killing horses. The front ranks of the Britons faltered under the storm, stumbling over their own dead, but those behind pressed forward, driving them into the Roman line. Then the legionaries drew their short swords and braced themselves. The clash was brutal. The Britons swung long swords, hacking wildly, but their blades were ill suited for the close press of bodies. The Romans thrust with precision, stabbing beneath ribs, into throats, under shields. Their shields pushed forward as one, their lines tight, their discipline unshaken. Every thrust brought another warrior down, and as the front ranks of Britons fell, the press from behind drove more into the slaughter. The noise was deafening, the cries of the wounded, the clash of iron, the shouts of commanders trying to be heard over the chaos. For the Britons it became a trap. Their numbers, once their strength, turned into weakness. They could not maneuver, could not use their chariots, could not bring their long swords to bear. They were packed too tightly, pressed against the Roman wall of shields, cut down in waves. The Romans advanced slowly, methodically, their lines driving forward like a wall of death. Cavalry on the flanks struck at those who tried to break free, cutting them down as they fled. Behind them the wagons and carts of the Britons' families, and supplies blocked their retreat, turning the plain into a killing ground from which there was no escape. Boudica's host fought with courage, but courage alone could not break the legions. For hours the slaughter continued, until the mass of the Britons collapsed into panic. The warriors at the front were butchered, those behind crushed in the press, and those at the rear trapped against their own wagons. Men, women, and even children were caught in the chaos. The Romans showed no mercy, cutting down all before them, turning the battlefield into a scene of horror. By the end, tens of thousands of Britons lay dead, their bodies piled high, their blood soaking the ground. Roman losses were light, a few hundred at most. It was not simply a defeat but a massacre. Boudica herself survived the battle, but her rebellion was broken. Accounts differ as to how she met her end. Some say she took poison to avoid capture, proud to the last, unwilling to be paraded in chains through Rome. Others say she fell sick and died soon after, her body buried in secret by her people. Whatever the truth, her role as leader ended with the destruction of her army at Watling Street. The rebellion that had burned so fiercely was extinguished in a single day of slaughter. The Romans wasted no time in reasserting control. Suetonius moved across the land with ruthless efficiency, punishing tribes that had joined the rising, imposing harsher rule than before, and reminding all of the price of defiance. Yet even in victory, Rome was shaken. The rebellion had killed more Romans and settlers than any other uprising in the province's history. 3 towns had been destroyed, a legion wiped out, and the governor himself nearly overwhelmed. The scars would not fade quickly. For the tribes, the defeat was crushing. Their dream of freedom ended in blood, their warriors dead, their families scattered, their queen gone. Yet the memory of what they had done could not be erased. They had burned Rome's towns, slaughtered its people, and shown the world that Britain was not so easily conquered. Even in defeat, Boudica became a symbol. Her name remembered not as that of a failure, but of a woman who dared to defy the greatest empire of her age. The clash at Watling Street was more than a battle. It was the turning point of a story written in fire and blood. It marked the end of the greatest revolt Rome ever faced in Britain, and the moment when Boudica's name passed from history into legend. The Romans may have won the field, but the queen who rose against them would be remembered far longer than the governor who defeated her. The field at Watling Street was strewn with the dead. The cries of the wounded and the stench of blood hung over the land, a reminder of how quickly triumph had turned to ruin. The rebellion that had begun with fire and vengeance ended in silence and smoke, the hopes of the tribes broken by the discipline of Rome. For Boudica, the sight of her people destroyed must have been unbearable. She had seen them march with pride, filled with belief that the gods walked with them, only to be cut down in their tens of thousands, trapped against their own wagons, slaughtered without mercy. She had given everything to the cause, her honor, her rage, her name. And yet now she was faced with the ruin of all she had built. No one knows exactly how long she lived after that day. The sources disagree, as they so often do when speaking of those Rome saw as enemies. Some said she fled the field and took poison, preferring death by her own hand rather than the shame of capture. Others said she fell ill soon after, perhaps from the strain of the campaign or the grief that consumed her, and that she died in her own land, buried by her people in secret. Still others whispered that she disappeared, her fate unknown, her body never found, leaving open the hope that she had been carried away by the gods she had called upon. What is certain is that she did not live long after her defeat, and that the rebellion ended with her. The idea of Boudica in chains, paraded through Rome as a captive, was one that her people could not bear to imagine. She had lived with too much pride, she had carried herself with too much dignity to allow such an end. The Romans themselves do not record her as a captive, which suggests she never fell into their hands. Instead, they wrote that she died, though they could not agree on how. The story of poison carried weight, for it was a common way for defeated leaders to deny Rome the satisfaction of spectacle. To die on her own terms was to deny her enemies their triumph, and so perhaps it is fitting that this is the version most often repeated. If she did take poison, it would not have been in despair but in defiance. To her people, her death would have been a final act of strength, the queen choosing her own fate rather than allowing her enemies to decide it. The Druids might have seen it as her passing into the realm of the gods, her soul continuing beyond death, her spirit still watching over the land. For the Romans it would have been a convenient end, removing the need for a show trial or the risk of further rebellion if she were kept alive. Whatever the truth, her death was the closing of a chapter written in blood and fire. Her daughters too vanished from the record. Their suffering had begun the rebellion. Their presence beside her had been a constant reminder of Rome's cruelty. But after Watling Street they fade from sight. Some believe they died with her, taking their own lives to avoid capture. Others think they lived on quietly among their people, their names hidden, their fate unspoken so that Rome could not claim them. They were symbols as much as children, and in their silence after the battle they became part of the legend of their mother. For the Iceni and their allies, the loss was more than numbers. It was the crushing of hope. They had believed they could drive Rome into the sea, that they could win back their freedom, that the gods had chosen them for victory. Instead they were left with ruin. Their warriors lay dead, their families scattered, their towns in ashes. Rome, shaken but not broken, moved swiftly to reassert control. Suetonius Paulinus, ruthless and efficient, carried his legions through the land, punishing all who had joined the rising. Villages were burned, hostages taken, fines imposed. The tribes were reminded again that Rome was not easily cast out, and that rebellion brought only destruction. Yet even in defeat, Boudica's name lived on. To her people, she was not only the queen who led them to ruin, but the queen who dared to rise. She had taken the lash and turned it into a war cry. She had taken the shame of her daughters and turned it into a banner. She had destroyed Roman towns, slaughtered their settlers, and humbled their pride, if only for a short while. Her rebellion showed that Rome was not invincible, that even the greatest empire could be shaken by the fury of a wronged woman and her people. For the Romans, she was a figure both feared and despised. They wrote of her in tones of horror, describing her as wild, cruel, and merciless, yet also acknowledging her power, her presence, and her courage. Tacitus, the historian who gave the fullest account, presented her as a tragic figure, wronged by Rome's greed and cruelty, rising in anger, and falling beneath Rome's discipline. Cassius Dio, writing later, painted her as a fearsome queen, tall, commanding, terrifying to behold, her long hair flowing, her voice strong. Even in their bias, even in their desire to belittle her, they could not deny her impact. The people of Britain must have kept her memory alive in stories told around fires, in whispers passed from parent to child, in songs sung in secret. She had become more than a queen. She had become a symbol of defiance, a spirit that lingered even after her body was gone. Her grave, if it ever existed, was hidden, and so she remained unclaimed by Rome, free in death as she had sought to be in life. The land itself was said to hold her, the fields of Norfolk, or perhaps the soil near London, though no one knew for sure. Her final resting place became a mystery, and with it a source of legend. The Romans, though victorious, did not forget her rebellion quickly. The scale of the destruction she caused was too great, the losses too heavy, the memory too raw. For years after, the province was unsettled, its governors wary, its legions kept ready. Rome had won the battle, but at a cost that made them question the value of the conquest. Only with time did they rebuild, re-establishing Londinium, fortifying their towns, and driving their rule deeper into the land. But the memory of what one queen had done remained a warning, a scar in the history of empire. Boudica's death, whatever its manner, marked the end of the greatest uprising Rome faced in Britain. Yet it did not mark the end of her story. Legends often grow from defeat as much as from victory, and hers was a life that inspired both fear and admiration. She had stood against an empire, and though she fell, she did so with her head held high. For her people she was the queen who dared. For her enemies she was the rebel who burned their towns. For history she became the warrior woman whose name would be remembered long after the legions themselves had gone. If we imagine her in those final moments, whether on the field of battle, in her home, or in the quiet of a hidden place, it is not despair that comes to mind, but resolve. She had given everything. She had led her people. She had struck her enemies. She had shaken the might of Rome. She could not have known that centuries later her story would still be told, that she would be remembered as one of the most famous figures of ancient Britain. But perhaps she hoped that her defiance would not be forgotten, and indeed it was not. Her death left a silence, but into that silence grew a legend. She became a figure who embodied both the tragedy and the strength of her people. The rebellion had ended, but the memory of Boudica was only beginning to take root. Rome had won, yet in her story she had won something greater, a place in history that no emperor, no governor, no legion could erase. The rebellion had ended in fire and ruin, yet the story of Boudica did not die with her body. Legends have a way of surviving when armies do not, and the memory of one woman's defiance against Rome grew, until it became part of the fabric of Britain itself. For the Romans, who wrote the first accounts, she was both warning and wonder. A barbarian queen who nearly tore a province from their grasp. For her people she was a symbol, a figure who had shown that even the mightiest empire could be shaken by rage and courage. And for later centuries she became more than a queen of the Iceni. She became an idea. In the years that followed her death, the province of Britain settled uneasily under Roman rule once more. The towns were rebuilt, Londinium rose again, and the legions remained ever watchful. The tribes beaten down were forced to accept Rome's dominance, but in their hearts the story of Boudica lived on. Around fires in the dark of winter her name would have been spoken, not in despair but with pride. She had been beaten, yes, but she had shown the spirit of freedom. Mothers told their daughters of the queen who fought. Fathers told their sons of the woman who led armies, and in this way her story passed on through the generations. The Romans too kept her name alive. Tacitus, writing decades after the rebellion, gave the most detailed account. His father-in-law had served in Britain under Suetonius Paulinus, and from him he heard the tales of the uprising. Tacitus painted Boudica as both victim and warrior, wronged by Roman cruelty and driven to vengeance, leading her people with passion, only to fall before Roman order. His words were shaped by his own view of empire, for he often criticized the greed and arrogance of Rome's governors, and in Boudica's story he found proof of the dangers of such abuses. To him she was both noble and tragic, a figure who revealed Rome's failings as much as its strength. Cassius Dio, writing a century later, added color to her image. He described her as tall, terrifying in presence, her hair long and fiery, her voice harsh, her words fierce. He gave her speeches, likely imagined, in which she denounced Rome and roused her people to war. His account was less concerned with sympathy and more with spectacle, but it ensured that her image as a fearsome queen endured. Between these two Roman voices the memory of Boudica entered history, shaped by men who had never known her, but who could not ignore the impact she had made. For many centuries after the Romans left Britain, her name faded into shadow. The tribes were gone, replaced by new peoples who brought their own leaders and their own stories. Saxons, Danes, and Normans each left their mark, and Boudica slipped into half-memory, her tale told in fragments, her name altered in sound until it was almost unrecognizable. Yet she was never wholly lost. In the medieval period, monks copied the old Roman texts, and in their chronicles the story of the rebel queen was preserved. She became a figure in the long history of Britain's struggles, sometimes remembered as a warning, sometimes as an example of pride. It was in the age of the Renaissance, when scholars once more turned to the texts of the classical world, that her story was brought to light again. Humanists rediscovered Tacitus and Dio, and in their pages they found Boudica. To a people now beginning to think of themselves as a nation distinct and proud, her rebellion against Rome spoke to something deep. In the 16th century, as England stood against Spain and the threats of foreign power, Boudica's name was revived as a symbol of native resistance. Poets and playwrights began to speak of her, shaping her into a figure of myth as much as history. The Elizabethan age found in her a mirror, a strong queen ruling a proud people, defying an empire that sought to crush her. This was a story that resonated in a land ruled by Elizabeth I. Boudica was claimed as an ancestor in spirit, a figure whose defiance gave strength to those who faced the Spanish Armada. The image of the warrior queen standing tall, her hair flowing, her daughters at her side, became a vision of national pride. She was no longer only a Celtic leader, but the embodiment of the island's spirit, a mother of the nation itself. In later centuries her image grew still greater. The Victorians, with their love of empire and their fascination with noble resistance, embraced her story. To them she was both tragic and heroic, a queen who fought bravely, but who showed the futility of resisting the might of civilization. Yet in her defiance they found something stirring. Statues were raised, most famously the bronze monument that still stands near the Houses of Parliament in London, showing her in her chariot, her daughters beside her, her arm raised as if calling her people to freedom. Erected in the 19th century, it fixed her image forever in the public imagination. Every passerby who looked upon it was reminded of the queen who had once dared to challenge Rome. Her name too was reshaped in these years. The old forms, Boudica, Bonduca, were gradually replaced by the version most familiar today, Boudica. In schools her story was taught as one of the great tales of ancient Britain. In books and poems she was celebrated, her speeches imagined, her courage praised. She became part of the story of the island itself, a figure who symbolized both resistance to oppression and the strength of women in leadership. In the modern age her legacy continues to shift. Historians look at her with new eyes, not only as a heroine but as a complex figure. They remind us that her rebellion was not only noble resistance, but also brutal, that tens of thousands of men, women, and children died at the hands of her army. They remind us that she fought not for all of Britain, but for her tribe and her people, and that her cause was both personal and political. Yet even with these reminders, her image as a symbol of freedom endures. People look to her as proof that even the powerless can strike against the mighty, that even those wronged can rise and be heard. Her name has been invoked in times of war, in struggles for women's rights, in movements for national pride. She has been seen as a warrior, as a mother, as a martyr, as a leader. Plays, novels, and films have told her story again and again, each shaping her in their own way, each using her to speak to the concerns of their own time. Sometimes she is fierce and merciless, sometimes noble and tragic, but always she is defiant. The land itself carries her shadow. Norfolk, where the Iceni once lived, claims her as its queen. London, rebuilt upon the ashes she left, raises her statue as if in uneasy recognition. Schools, ships, and even trains have been named after her, her name carried into places she never dreamed of. She is both local and national, both historical and mythical. Few other figures from so long ago have endured in the same way. Her legacy is also a reminder of how history is shaped. The Romans wrote her story first, framing it through their own eyes. Later ages took those fragments and turned them into something larger. Each generation has found in her what it wished to see. To some she was a savage barbarian, to others a noble patriot, to others still a symbol of female power. The truth of her life, the woman herself, remains half hidden, glimpsed only through the smoke of her rebellion. Yet perhaps that is what makes her so powerful. She is both real and larger than life, both flesh and legend. When people look upon her statue in London today, they see more than a queen of the first century. They see the spirit of resistance, the pride of a people who will not be broken, the strength of a mother defending her children, the courage of a woman who refused to bow. Her story has outlived the empire that once crushed her, outlived the legions that once marched across her land. Rome is gone, but Boudica remains. From the day she rose to the day she died, her life was filled with struggle. She suffered deeply, she struck fiercely, and she fell in ruin, yet her name endured. That endurance is her true victory. Empires rise and fall, but the memory of those who resist them can last forever. Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, mother, warrior, rebel, has become part of the identity of Britain itself. Her legacy stretches from the ashes of Camulodunum to the bronze that shines by the Thames. She is at once ancient and eternal, a woman of her time and a figure for all times.